Okay, now we've cleaned up the fuel tank, carburetor and the other parts overnight, just soaking it in degreaser. I'm just gonna just dry it with the air compressor. Okay, so now we have all the little parts, they're all cleaned up. The carburetor itself is nice and clean, just like I bought one, really nice. I think that's like the intake. Over here, this is the intake, it's all nice and clean, that little metal metal vent. These are the bolts, the 5 screws that hold it to the actual fuel tank. But yeah, it came up quite nice, and using an air compressor is quite handy. There's still a bit of water in there, I could probably give it a bit more of a blowout, but everything has come up quite pretty. I've turned the mower around. Before I start fiddling around underneath and pulling things apart and cleaning under the deck, and maybe even pulling the shroud off, I'm gonna remove the oil. It's gonna need an oil change anyway, but it's good to remove the oil before you start turning things over, because you don't really want oil leaking out all over the place and getting into the wrong places. To remove the oil, I've got one of these Briggs & Stratton oil removal kits. So this is like a pump, essentially. Use this as a pump, connect it to this little hose, and it sort of nests inside this bottle, and you can collect it and dispose of it safely at a dump station. So I'm just going to demonstrate how to do that, and we'll see how dark this oil is. Well, there's oil in it. There is oil in it. Doesn't look like it's over full. With these, doesn't really matter what end that you connect it to, but underneath, well, on the top, you'll have this little hole, and I like to sort of push it through so it just comes out just a little bit, so it's nice and tight. With the oil container, they have like a little seal here. It typically gets in the way, so I just take that off and just stick it in. Because it's cone shaped, if you push down on it hard, it should form a pretty good seal. And you want to stick this end of the hose down as far as you can go, so right down deep into the sump. So when I start pumping, you should see some oil coming through the tube. Just make sure it is all the way down. Sometimes this job's done a little bit easier with 2 people. You already see that oil coming. Push it all the way down. I like to just keep pumping it. And if you think that you've got all of it, you probably haven't. So what you can do is just get something to prop the mower up onto, and you might just get a little bit more. It sounds pretty empty. This is a bit of a messy task at the best of times. Typically just get a rag. When you pull this tube out, you will get some drips. I like to let it gravity feed into the container if you can. And if you know that you're not using this for a while, it's good to maybe just spray a little bit of carby cleaner down there, and it should clean all this out. Okay, so there's the captured dirty oil. I think it was a little bit low on oil, it doesn't seem like very much. And here's the tube again, not perfectly clean, but it's not too bad either. If you spot some in there, the carby cleaner, if you spray it in the tube, will help clean it out. I'll just see if I can get that remaining little bit out. And there you go, that's not too bad. The carby cleaner is great because it's a solvent that pretty much dissolves almost anything, but at the same time you got to be careful because it is very toxic, carcinogenic. So I suggest always keeping gloves on. Nitrile gloves are my glove of choice. Another thing to do is always put the dipstick back in. Believe it or not, people have forgotten these and you end up having to get a whole other scrap mower just to get your dipstick. Also, it stops things like bugs and anything falling into the sump. So what I'm going to do now is I think I might take off this shroud. Doesn't hurt to have a little look in there. Sometimes it's dirty, so just bear with me while we take this off. Alright, that's one shroud removed. Looks pretty good, just a little bit rusty, that's all. Nothing of concern really there. I'm just going to put that aside. They're rusty. I like to give them a bit of a sand up with some fine sandpaper. And you shouldn't have to re-gap this if it was already starting. So I'm going to sand these up, clean them up. And if you're curious what this is acts to sort of as a brake. So when you take the throttle off, it doesn't allow as much air to flow through. It causes more resistance. You can see there's some grass built up in here. Now I can either blow that out with the air compressor, or and there's a build up here and here. I can blow it out with the air compressor or suck it out with the vacuum. I'm going to choose to suck it out with the vacuum. Okay, so here's some wet and dry sandpaper. This is probably the best thing to use, just a bit of really fine wet and dry. Just take it, and you don't really want to be too aggressive. You just want to, these sections here, just very gently give it a little sand. So I've given that a bit of a clean up. They should provide a spark to the coil a bit better. That's something I like to do if I'm pulling a mower down. Just sand these up, it will help it start the mower a little easier. So I've just turned the mower over and I'm just having a little look at these blades. They're actually not too bad. So they're not as bad as I thought they would be. They've had a little bit of work. but they're not too bad. I might just better clean, and this is the cutting edge, this is the leading edge. I might just better get a file and touch that up a bit and sharpen that up. I thought I'd have to replace these blades, but they actually don't look too bad at all. Inside the deck there's still grime and things like that. I might put a bit of a general purpose cleaner in here and spray it out, maybe with the gurney. I've got this screw. I'm just going to put it in here, and I might put a bit of tape over this just to prevent any oil shooting out. I actually shot some oil straight over the top of the mower when I turned the blades. So I'm just going to tape this up before I take it out and clean it. Okay, so this is where the spark plug goes into the chamber. I've blocked this off with tape, as well as this hole too. Block these off so we don't get water into the engine. So I've just finished spraying it down with the gurney to get a lot of the stuff off. I gave it a bit of a spray with the air compressor. Now I'm going to vacuum it as well. This is a wet and dry vac, so it's safe to use with a bit of water. I'm going to just try to get any excess little bit of water off the actual mower before I do anything else to it. given under the deck a little bit of a tidy up. There is just that one little hole on the top of the deck, which is of no significance really. I'm just going to give it a final clean up, and we might spray some underbody rust protector spray. Okay, so that's the rust converter painted on. I'll let that sit probably for about 30 minutes, and then I'll wipe it clean with acetone before painting. So before I paint, I've just covered up the 4 wheels just with plastic bags. A lot quicker and easier than taking all the wheels off, especially when it's really just a refurbishment. It's not a full restoration. I've just covered up underneath the engine as well, and I think this is called the Blade Boss. So I've covered that up, and I'm just going to spray under here with just a little bit of this Cold Gal black zinc coating. It'll just help prevent it from rusting any further really. I might just paint the whole lot under here. I was going to maybe not paint these, but it's not going to hurt if someone later on wants to take the engine off. That's kind of their issue, I suppose, but let's have a look. It's now like the 3rd day I've been working on this mower. I've only had limited time to do it. So the last thing I did was I pulled the blades off, and I think it's called the Blade Boss that holds the swing blades. I gave it a good clean up and painted it, just so all the rust is off there, sharpen up the blades, and you can see it looks much better. This is Cold Gal, cold zinc, and I have sharpened up the blades. I put the red just on the tips, just so people can see that it has had a little bit of attention. I didn't need to replace these blades. They were actually in pretty good condition, so I did manage to save the ones I bought for another project. So hopefully we'll get that back on tomorrow, because it probably needs a bit more time to dry. As you can see, my fingers got a bit red. I should have had gloves on, so yeah, that needs a bit more time to dry. What we're going to do, probably just this afternoon, I want to basically just have a little look at the deck, just give it a little clean up. Maybe I'll think about it, give it a little coat, little spray, and once that's dried overnight, then I can think about putting the whole thing back together. These handles, I might give them a bit of a spray as well. Just looks a little bit shabby, but that's not a big deal. So I'm just going to use a little bit of this steel wool. It's a fine grade. This is really good for a lot of things. I use it to finish off timber, but if you're going to sort of do another coat of paint on a mower, instead of being really harsh and sanding it back or grinding it when you don't really need to, you just use a bit of steel wool and rub it over the entire deck. The next day, let's just have a look what I did yesterday afternoon. So, as you can see, I gave the mower just a little primer coat. I didn't put too much care into it. To be honest, I was kind of over it a little bit in the afternoon, so I just gave it a quick spray over, and the spots where it's dripped from the aerosol can, that should be sorted out, because I'm probably going to give this a very light sand with steel wool. You can see where it's covered the rust. It's still a little bit, the surface isn't very smooth there, but it's much better than it was having exposed rust. I plan to paint over this with just a generic gloss red. Of interest, over here, this was my first ever attempt at fixing up a rust hole, and I used that product, that Septone, I think it's called Metal Filler or Tech Filler. It's mixed with, it's a mixture of stainless steel and fiberglass fibers, and I've got to sand this down smooth. After that, I'll probably just give the whole mower a little bit of a just a brush down with steel wool, and I might spray the red paint on. So let's see how this sort of turns out. So that's just after sanding. You can still sort of see where that hole was, but the edges are nice and smooth now, and I'll probably give that a little quick coat of primer. And after I do the primer and the red paint, and then maybe an acrylic over the top, this hopefully should be filled in a little bit, but I'm pretty happy with that. First time ever doing bodywork, and I think that's not a bad sort of finish. So I just used up 1 can of paint on the mower. I'm not going to invest more than 1 can of red paint on this mower because it is just a mower. You can clearly see it's not perfect, and that's, you know, it's not great, but the thing is, it is just a mower. This isn't meant to be like a classic car or something, but the paint looks fairly even. There's probably a couple little drip spots, but it doesn't look too bad. Just for 1 can of cheap acrylic gloss paint. That's going to have to dry at least overnight before I put the acrylic on, I think. And we'll see how that goes. This is the recoil cover, and I just brushed it up really well, got all the surface rust off it. I did a rust conversion sort of wipe over it. That's why you've got these areas where black. That's where the rust has been converted, so it's not going to be corroding anymore. So I've just taped up the manufacturer's labels, and I'm going to give this a coat of primer, and then when that dries I'll give it a coat of black paint. A little update. This is the fuel tank. I gave a little primer coat to it before I put black on there. Obviously I covered up with painter's tape where the carburetor mounts, and I covered up the fuel cap too because I didn't want that being painted itself. Here is the air filter cover. I've cleaned them up a little bit, taken off most of the surface rust, and I've just given them a coat of this rust converter. So you can sort of almost see that in action. This rust that I couldn't get off with the wire wheel is turning black, and it's in that form. It's inert, it's not going to continue to rust. So when that's finished curing, I'll do the same thing with this. I'll give it a primer coat, let it dry, and then I'll give it the black coat. It'll look like a new one. Over here you can see this recoil shroud after I've given it a coat of primer. I think it actually looks quite nice, and I've been able to prevent any further rust in that one as well. I've taken all the rust off the handle, used the wire wheel for that, gave it a real nice general sand as well, just to get just to rough up that old paint, and I've primed the this before I'm going to paint it black again. Over here we have the air filter shroud or cover. Same thing, I've just basically taken off all the rust and gave it a good prime coat before I paint it black. Here is the handles that connect the main push handle to the mower frame. There was a lot of rust on there, and I cleaned them up and primed them as well.